and you are listening to the Braver Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. I'm your host, John Wood Jr. Well, I am glad to be joined, first of all, by three very special people, three good friends of mine, to talk about a topic that is, I think in my mind, sort of the important topic, in a sense, in American political and sort of philosophical life. At least it's the most important thing that nobody else is talking about. And we're going to shine a light on this issue today. We are here to talk about the philosophy of nonviolence. I am joined by my good friend, Harry Boyte, by Mr. Damien Connors and Miss April Lawson. Harry is a longtime civil rights activist and community organizer. Damien is from that up-and-coming generation of forward-looking thinkers, community organizers, preachers. He's the former executive director of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. April Lawson is a writer, public intellectual, increasingly public intellectual, I ought to say, and the director of debates at Braver Angels. And I'm your humble host, of course. Folks, it's good to see you all. How are you all doing today?
Good to be here.
Great.
Okay, wonderful. So as I was saying before we got rolling, I think that the four of us all have something in common, and that is the fact that I think that we all see in the philosophy of nonviolence, which is the philosophy by which Martin Luther King Jr., Bayard Rustin, and others led the nonviolent movement, the nonviolent wing of the civil rights movement in the late 1950s and the 1960s. I think we see in the substance of the philosophy of nonviolence a means by which Americans can pursue both justice and community simultaneously. And I think that the major thing that has been lacking in our politics, our partisan and our racial politics, et cetera, in American life, has been an avenue for being able to pursue our differences without destroying our relationships and destabilizing institutions, et cetera, at the same time. So we're not in the same period of time, of course, as Martin Luther King Jr. and others in previous generations were. And yet, if there's any wisdom to the things that they did, to the things that he taught, it seems worthwhile for us to explore that here today and to look at what aspects of that, or to look at the body of that philosophical work and to see how it might help steer us towards the type of community that we want to see in this country now. So Harry, I want to, this is free-flowing conversation. We can all ask ourselves anything that we want, but Harry, I want to start with you here. It seems to me that nonviolence has kind of gone out of style a little bit somehow. We all love Dr. King. We have a holiday for him. He has a statue in DC, monuments in his honor. We don't talk very much about the substance of nonviolence. Why?
Well, I think there are several reasons. It's a rigorous set of disciplines of everyday life. So part of the problem is a conceptual problem that nonviolence is thought about either as pacifism, or it's thought about as a tactic, a way to resist oppressive forces. But the heart of nonviolence was a philosophy of everyday life, and it was certainly informed by the Indian independence movement in India and Gandhi, but it was deeply rooted in the American soil, I would say. There were different roots like Jane Addams, but the strongest was the African-American experience. And it was a philosophy that was fed by personalism, or the belief that everyone has immense value and untapped potential. Howard Thurman was a great teacher of Martin Luther King and a philosopher of personalism. It was also a central philosophy at Morehouse, where Dr. King went to school. And it was a practice. So we think about it as simply an individual philosophy, but in fact, it was rooted in cultures of institutions like Emmanuel, African Methodist Episcopal Church in South Carolina, which experienced that terrible shooting, which was one of the first Black churches, I think the second in the country from 1817, in the heart of the slave South. It was an independent source of freedom and also a spirit of generosity and love towards the enemies, as was exemplified in the amazing forgiveness of the community after the shooting in 2015. So it was grounded in institutions like churches and schools and colleges, and I think that's what gave it depth. And we've seen an erosion of those settings, and we've seen a different culture where the idea of not demonizing and hating your opponents, not trying to destroy them or devalue them, that's really out of fashion. It's out of fashion on the left as well as the right.
Yeah, it's well, it's a funny thing, isn't it? There doesn't seem to be a lot of political points that one can rack up by humanizing his or her opponent. We've sort of built up the architecture of political discourse around this idea of owning and destroying the people who you disagree
Us
with.
versus them, a kind of war metaphor.
Yeah, which makes me wonder how it is a young brother like Damien Connors wound up finding himself schooled in this type of a moral and social discipline. Damien, can you say a little bit about your own relationship to nonviolence and sort of how do you see the philosophy and the perspective intertwining with the needs of the moment?
Yeah, so I was introduced to Kingian nonviolent conflict reconciliation when I was a student at Emory University in 2009 through 2010. I was introduced to a young man by the name of Bernard Lafayette, who was a visiting scholar at the time, and I became his teaching assistant for a while, and then began to kind of share with him in the leadership of some of the courses there at Emory. And Bernard Lafayette is a trainer in Kingian nonviolence, and I was introduced through him, but it was being introduced to it by someone who not only trains others in it, but is also someone who practices Kingian nonviolence. And nonviolence as a philosophy throughout and across his life. So to see it in real time through a person and to actually be learning the principles and the steps and all of the background kind of philosophical pieces that pull it together was really a meaningful introduction to Kingian nonviolence and nonviolence in general. And I was able to hear as a preacher, sometimes the text a little bit differently, because for me, nonviolence really became an orientation or disposition. So it's not something that you can easily lay aside when the circumstances aren't convenient. And so one of the first principles in nonviolent, Kingian nonviolence specifically, is that a nonviolent life is a courageous life, nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. And to the last point, it takes a lot of courage to be nonviolent and to think of your political enemy in some instances as also your neighbor. And I think in this moment, to the point that Harry made, we suffer because there's not a willingness for those who are seeking to get that political point, to your point, John, to look at the fuller situation and to think about how amid all of the differences, do we come to some common ground to get things done together? I think, nonviolence, it requires a level of intentionality and a willingness to want to engage, and to have that on as a dispositional orientation, I think shifts the way that folks enter conversations. So I think, in our moment, we could really benefit from folks who were invested in this idea and philosophy.
Yeah, I want to just jump in here for a second. So since I mostly have a lot to learn from you two, I'm going to just ask a few questions myself. And so one of the things I was curious about is sort of from either of you, but actually, yeah, you have different vantage points on this potentially. I'm interested in the relationship between, it seems like one of the biggest changes that's happened in American society over the last half century or century is the decline of institutionalized religion. And what that means is that we don't we no longer have sort of in common parlance. I used to work for David Brooks of the New York Times, and he always talked about how we've lost a moral vocabulary, that it's not just that people don't go to church, it's that we don't have the concepts that we need in the same way that we used to. And what that means is that we end up with no way to, it becomes much harder to balance things like the evil in another person with their fundamental child of God status or whatever. And so I'm curious whether, and yet, right, nonviolence, this philosophy was born in India in a less, I presume, I don't actually know, a less religious context. And I'm just interested in how you two see that. And Damien, in particular, how to navigate. So the secular way of understanding community and justice seems to involve, like, the thing that people, I would imagine, say when they don't want to engage nonviolently or have all voices be heard or whatever, is that erases my experience. And that is also, that's something that comes from psychology, or that de-emphasizes, or that's part of the structure of oppression, or you know, those sorts of things. And those come from more secular psychology and social theory, which also seem to bear on these situations. And so I'm just interested in, like, how you guys would navigate the way that these things fit together.
And Damien, I think that a part of that is sort of the religious component, right? So in other words, if we have a moral language that has a relationship to nonviolence through Christianity, and if we don't have that sort of shared kind of, you know, religious architecture undergirding it now, you know, is there a way in which the philosophy doesn't travel as well? Or, you know, is nonviolence nevertheless applicable, you know, in a moment where you have increasing secularization and people feel like empathizing with your enemy sort of erases your experience as an individual, right? You know, coming from the standpoint of a marginalized community, let's say.
Mm-hmm. So to be quite honest, I struggle even with the idea of, I guess there can be kind of shared moral language, but I think that what I've seen to be one of the most, or I've experienced to be one of the more effective ways to communicate the types of principles that would lead to a certain type of language. And by language, I mean certain ways of communicating that sometimes don't have vocabulary connected to it. It by creating conditions in which people can begin to recognize the other as someone who is of the same value as them, right? So I think it becomes a relationality challenge as opposed to like creating some language, because people speak differently. People have different cues from one culture, from one community to the next. And I think in the context of creating conditions where we can begin to see the value in the other and see them as ourselves. There's this book, I forget the full title, but the first part of it is Imago Dei, and it has to do with specifically Dr. King's thoughts around nonviolence specifically, and how we grant value to other people. But I think that there's so much opportunity there. And unlike some of my close friends, you know, I do believe that there is value in leadership. I think there's value in having the right people in the right positions that we honor and that we recognize that, to have some weight or value, to create conditions where people can begin to come together and see the value, kind of the humanity in the next person. For me, that's a starting point. And I only say that because I've witnessed conversations break down around, like, you know, what language we're going to use. How do we use that language? Should that language be a broader language, you know, across the culture? And, you know, given an age where, you know, we dissect almost everything, I think that there's some universal pieces here that generally work from one community to the next, from one culture to the next, that don't necessarily necessitate a language that may be connected to a specific faith tradition, that may be connected to another set of doctrine or beliefs, that then derail conversations because we get into the nuances of people's, beliefs as opposed to just kind of the bare value conversation. And Eddie Glaude talked about this in some ways when he speaks to white supremacy and what all of that means in the context of folks coming together as the value gap. And I think it's an important idea, and I think that there are ways to do that. And one of the ways is, for me, just really trying to sit with the principles of nonviolence, particularly Kingian nonviolence, and sitting with the steps and kind of sitting with the implications of those steps as well. What does it require of me, right, to humble myself just enough to be in conversation with someone who can, give me a different experience across our difference, or enlighten me in a way that I may not have been enlightened before.
So here's just really quick, Harry. Here's something fundamental here. In a speech that Dr. King gave when he was a very young man to the YMCA in 1957, he talked about the aims of nonviolence, the outcomes. And in here he says that another thing that we had to get over was the fact that the nonviolent resistor does not seek to humiliate or defeat the opponent, but to win his friendship and his understanding. This was always a cry that we had to set before people, that our aim is not to defeat the white community, not to humiliate the white community, but to win the friendship of all the persons who have perpetrated this system in the past. The end of violence or the aftermath of violence is bitterness. The aftermath of nonviolence is reconciliation and the creation of a beloved community. A boycott is never an end within itself. It is merely a means to awaken a sense of shame within the oppressor, but the end is reconciliation. The end is redemption. And it seems to me that in the moment that we are in, one of the big things that so many of us notice is that there doesn't seem to be a clear avenue towards redemption or reconciliation in our social conversations at present. So, Harry, you were saying.
Well, let me begin with something Damien said. So, courage in nonviolence is the first principle in King's list in Pilgrimage Toward Nonviolence, and it's the courage of action, but it's also the courage of engagement. So, as King said, and the scholars of King like Montaigne, the Indian philosopher, and Daniel Allen all point out, it's harder to be engaged in the nonviolent way than it is to be violent. It takes a different kind of discipline. And it's, as King said in another one of his principles, it transforms first not the other, but oneself. You discover in yourself well springs of courage and self-worth and possibility you didn't know you had. Now, I think those are universal. I think it was not only Gandhi. In fact, Gandhi didn't think of nonviolence. Their roots are traditions like Tolstoy or Hinduism in India. But in the United States, Jane Addams and William James were talking about a nonviolent approach before Gandhi even began to practice. So, but in the United States, the philosophies that fed nonviolence, like personalism, I think of profound relevance and across cultures. Basically that everyone has an inestimable value and dignity and worth and complexity and possibility. Even the people you see as your enemies need to be engaged with what King called agape, which I think is public love, or actually the mayor of Istanbul, who won against a very violent attack. I think it's pronounced, his name is Magolu, but he called for radical love against his political opponents, but also people of different faith traditions and different value systems. So there's that philosophical tradition, but I think also the other thing in nonviolence that it's really crucial to remember, and that we find actually engages, say, young people who want to make change, is that it's a different kind of politics. So King's second principle, that you need to understand your enemy, not humiliate them. The third principle, that you separate the sin from the sinner. Those were not simply individual practices. Those were taken by Bayard Rustin, and I expect that Bayard Rustin had something to do with King learning those in a deep way, to be the philosophy of the movement. So, for example, Bayard Rustin framed the March on Washington. He was the organizer for the march, in which King gave the amazing "I Have a Dream" speech. But in a way, King's speech was also embodying Reston's strategy, which was, this is not a protest. I was there. I heard King practice I Have a Dream on my father's sleeping floor the night before he gave the speech.
That's pretty amazing.
Dad had just gone on staff. But Dad told me then, and I knew much more later, that Reston understood the march as a conversation with America. And the way he understood it, which really is this point that you don't demonize or attack your opponents, are the people in the middle. You win them over through a conversation. It's not us versus them. I think this is a difference actually with Gade than someone like Reston. Reston's argument was that a third of the country was more or less sympathetic to the movement. A third was pretty diehard opposition at that point, which actually included all of my southern relatives outside my immediate family. But that meant that a third or more needed to be won over. And the movement couldn't win them over by guilt tripping them or saying this is what you should do. It needed to appeal to their own dreams and interests and values and the American project. So that's really a realization of the political, different kind of politics, but the political quality of the movement and nonviolence in the movement, the understanding those who are not on your side, not trying to demonize them or create an us versus them relationship.
Damien, I'm sorry, I was just going to ask Damien very quickly, as a practitioner of Kingian nonviolence, though, you mentioned sitting with the principles of nonviolence, and Harry has sort of shown the differences in character of nonviolence as an approach to social conflict, versus traditional political approaches. But the traditional way in which we engage arguments is to, I think, lean from our frustration and our bitterness and our indignity and our anger, because it comes so naturally to us. Just from a practical level, how do you manage to actually demonstrate or feel within yourself this love for the opponent, when I'm sure, correct me if I'm wrong, but I imagine that you yourself probably feel some frustrations from time to time when you look at the things that people may be doing and saying in this country that veer against the interests of all sorts of people. How do you summon that feeling of agape love within yourself that is able to animate that kind of a social action?
Yeah. So I literally do sit with the principles, as particularly when moments arise where I actually do need to kind of embody the principles. But there are a few principles that kind of stick out for me. And one is that you choose love over hate. And for me, it's kind of down the list, but it helps animate the other principles for me. And the other one is that you're seeking to address the injustice, not the people. And that's what Harry meant when you choose, you don't go after the sinner, you go after the sin. So this idea that we're pursuing the injustice, not the individual, those things I sit with on a regular basis. And one of, when talking about Kingian nonviolence, we talk about Dr. King a lot. And so he's described as being eclectic, as somebody who was willing to pull ideas from almost anywhere, and then kind of filter them through his Hegelian approach, which was to emerge at a kind of emergent truth, so to speak. And so to take all sides into consideration, to come to a middle ground and be able to find some common ground with folks, so that you do seek to win the friendship and not just, a point that you're trying to make. And I think for me, particularly in the context of doing community organizing and working in and around community, or even within faith communities, that work has to be done as well. Particularly in the space where you're addressing inequities in education. For instance, some of the work I did in Connecticut, where it's really difficult because you have really strong opinions on both sides, but you still have to create the conditions where folks feel comfortable enough to have a healthy conversation about the challenges they're facing together so that they can arrive at some type of common ground. And so for me, those principles have meant a lot to how I even filter strategy. What I think about when I approach strategic planning, are mapping out, you know, what our program year would look like at other organizations that I've been at. So there are plenty of the King Center has those principles on their website and the steps that are associated with Kenyan Nonviolence. But I certainly think that as a philosophy, it really helps ground a perspective that is people oriented and that leads you to people as opposed to like your corner and your point.
So
Yeah, you know,
I just want to.
just let me say, so it is a philosophy, a living philosophy. King was a great philosopher. As a Brandon and Terry collection, To Shape a New World makes clear. He was a great political philosopher, and part of the problem with academia is reflected in the fact that he has not been taken seriously as a great political philosopher and thinker and moral philosopher. But it's also important to, the movement's power gains its power not from simply a philosophy, but from the way it was lived in practice by everyday people. Maids and janitors and sharecroppers and teachers. And I worked in the part of Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which you would know a lot about, Damien. It's called the Citizenship Schools. We had 900 citizenship schools across the South, in church basements and beauty parlors and community centers, sometimes in schools, but they weren't formal. And they taught literacy and numeracy, but they also taught nonviolence and a little bit of community organizing. And patriotism, interestingly enough. I have the curriculum. A big section says, we love America and we're going to make it live up to its ideals. Right. But it was the power of everyday citizens really taking on this philosophy and seeing it as both a reflection of the best in their religious and political tradition, but also as a way to make change that would be lasting and not demonizing and not negative. And of course, you know, it was immensely effective in ending segregation. That the shift that was challenging was to shift from the struggle against oppression to the struggle of a beloved, inclusive, thriving, healthy community for all. Although I think actually there have been advances on that front. It's not, and in fact, I would also say that Braver Angels, to bring it directly, I think April, your whole debate practices is an example of nonviolence in action. People can, and John, I know you're involved in this too, you can have really sharp disagreements, but it doesn't mean you demonize or devalue the other person, or you accuse them, or you moralize, or you have an upmanship. I mean, that is so different than today's campus discussions or many community discussions about hot issues, hot button issues. I think Braver Angels is really trying to embody a nonviolent philosophy, whether people call it that or not.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned that, just because it's one of the things about the depolarization space is that there's a lot of emphasis on sort of soft, gentle communication. And I would frankly kind of say either conflict avoidance or conflict like delicacy. And like, there's just and the whole point of the debates program in some way, it's funny because you're right. It's a thing where the method is the lesson, like the form is the meaning. And so it's a style of debate that is where the whole point is we can have conflict and totally see each other as like smart, interesting, respectable, like deeply worthy people who have deep good in them on the other side. And that is a very consistent result. It's not and
it's very rare today.
It is, and it's why I am consistently fighting with people about whether we should call them debates, because that word has been, it's sort of like the word conflict is another one that has been so, people only think of bad things when they hear those words. And so part of our overall goal is or my overall goal anyway, is to redeem debate as a form of engagement, and to say, to sort of illustrate also the point that like we can have conflict and it doesn't have to just be not only does it not have to destroy us, but it can be constructive for relationship, not just destructive. And so it's funny because you're making me feel hopeful again, but I was about to ask a very cynical question of you two. So I hope you'll indulge me just for a second, which is roughly, I think when I think about the sort of, I don't know, sound and tenor of discourse today, I think the question that it would present is, are we really trying to persuade people? Like, did the nonviolence movement really persuade people? Like, there's, I think, an overall skepticism of that people are persuadable, or that's really a worthwhile endeavor at sort of at all. And particularly that, like, there's the sort of feeling of how long do we have to wait for justice? If we have to wait until every last person in whatever dominant group we're talking about sees my point of view, that's too long. I've waited way too long already. And so there's, I think at the moment in the sort of in the zeitgeist of the country, particularly, well, really it's on both sides, but more explicitly anyway, on the left, there's let's find the levers of power and turn them, not a let's bring people along with us, not a persuasion approach. And
so that particular understanding of power is domination.
Oh, yes. Well, so talk about that, because I want to, let's refute that. let's help people understand that persuasion is relevant. And yeah, tell me what do you mean about that as an understanding of power, Harry?
Well, I practice both kinds, so I have a personal experience. I grew up in a family in the South, in Atlanta, Georgia, where my parents were one of a very few white European Americans of Scottish descent who were outspokenly against segregation. My mother helped to lead the effort to desegregate the libraries and the League of Women Voters, and Dad desegregated the restaurant and then got involved in school desegregation. That cost them. They really were brutalized. My father was almost killed by the American Nazi Party in Southern Virginia. So by the time I went to college, I was a very angry kid. And I was not nonviolent. And my philosophy of dealing with people who I thought were wrong, segregationists, racists, was to batter them down any way I could figure out. But that was before Dad really, well, he went on staff in '63. But before I started working as a field secretary and learning from everyday people, my main mentors were people like the maids and janitors at Duke, who were nonviolent in their effort to improve their conditions. So I came to understand pretty clearly that the dominant understanding of power, which is power over, we're going to get these people to do what we think they should do, is actually not very effective. It's much more effective to use the principles of understanding where your opponents are coming from, developing a kind of generative understanding of power that's connected to love. This was one of King's last major points, that power and love need to always be combined. But if you have love without power, it's sentimentality. If you have power without love, it's brutal force. So there's a different understanding of power when you connect it to what I would call agape or public love. It means you see possibilities for changing the relationship, and it doesn't mean everybody comes along. What it means is that you appeal to the better angels of people, and you, in many cases, people change, not through being converted, but through seeing themselves and other people in a different way. So it's actually a self-transformation. That's what I saw. I saw it across the South, and I had many experiences like that. Talked my way out of getting a group of Klans guys who were going to lynch me.
Told me this, yeah, it's crazy.
And then King assigned me to organize with poor whites, and I saw a lot of potential for poor whites to make alliances in Durham, North Carolina with the Black community, and that's continued. That's been a continuing legacy from the late 1960s and early 70s. So I've just seen a different kind of power that's more generative, not power over, but power to. That's how I put it. I'd like to know what Damien is your experience of nonviolence.
Yeah, so I think the persuasion piece is just a matter of how you decide to define persuasion, right? Or think about persuasion, because there's a persuasive spirit to nonviolence, the philosophy of nonviolence, that doesn't look for an immediate political win, but is looking to invest way of thinking and being in the world in the way that people live it.
That's right.
And I think that is what, in the larger idea of, the arc of the moral universe being long, but bending toward justice, that's the investment that's made. And it requires folks who are willing to be courageous, who are willing to put love over hate, folks who are willing to seek justice as opposed to, attacking individuals. It takes a level of commitment, and to use Harry's term, discipline, to live it out in a way that you are contributing and planning through the things that you do and the ways that you engage, the type of spirit of coming together, of loving, of pursuing the true injustice into the kind of larger universe, the larger moral universe, so to speak. And so that's how I think about it, right? So I don't think of it in the short term. I think we all want quick fixes in the microwave society, but I think with this philosophy, it just requires a little bit more of us, a little bit more of our mind, a little bit of our time, and intentionality.
And a belief that everyone wants to live in a certain way, in a holy fashion, whether one calls that religious or not. But everyone
absolutely
intuits and aspires to being part of the holy. And that's really a foundational principle in the nonviolent philosophy.
Yeah.
So that leads me to consider a difference in the context. When Dr. King was alive, he was a leader of many Americans, but he was viewed as the foremost leader of Black America, right? Even though he had a message that clearly sought to resonate beyond just African Americans and civil rights activists, and ultimately it did. And the result of that is that Martin Luther King Jr. now stands as an American, as sort of a secular saint in our society. Granted, we just all sort of agreed that the substance of his philosophy isn't much talked about, but his legacy is now something that we sort of feel a joint ownership of as a nation. And yet I can imagine that you might have some folks who sort of look at nonviolence and say, well, wait a second, this was a way of being in the world, a way of engaging in justice that was naturally a tool for oppressed people to use. And so it may not be immediately sort of clear how it is that people who are not particularly oppressed, people who, let's just say it plainly, white folks, rich folks, folks who are not sort of in a marginal or looked at as being in a marginal status, men, okay, well, to apply.
Right. You can get a whole list.
I just had to say that.
You can go down the whole list, but you get the point though, right? The question here is there a way in which we need to expand our understanding of nonviolence to understand that it really is something for everybody? That if you're punching upwards to fight for justice, or to be a good citizen, So let's fill that out. Harry, how is it that nonviolence is something that can be applied by all of us in the conversation today towards the collective ends of a better and a freer and a more equal society?
Well, who was it? Did you say microwave culture, Damien?
You did.
Yeah.
Hashtag that.
I think we live in a microwave culture where efficiency and quickness and getting from here to there cheaper and faster is the coin of the realm. And people are told that the happiness is more and more what you have. I don't think that's the path to happiness. I think everybody, in a way, even rich people, but especially middle-class people and people in suburbs, and they're also, they live in a warped culture that actually is frenetic and overpaced. Our colleague Bill Doherty, who was one of the co-founders of Braver Angels, has done a lot of work with middle-class families around the hidden discontents of the middle class of different races, but the overscheduled, hyper pressure to get your kids into Ivy League schools and to make a lot of money and to have a bigger and bigger house and to have a bigger birthday party for your kids than anybody else you know. It's a formula for misery and hollowness and emptiness and loneliness. So I think nonviolence in its constructive formulation, which is about not only opposing injustice and oppression, but creating a healthier, more fulfilling, more thriving, more just life and community. That most everybody hungers for that, whether people don't know how to get there, but it's really a deep, deep desire. So that's one of the reasons I am not pessimistic. I think I would say I'm not optimistic, but I'm certainly hopeful that there are well springs of possibility and energy and motivation in America that nonviolence can tap.
Larry, you used the phrase constructive nonviolence. Could you elaborate on that just a little bit more? Because many people may not be familiar with that particular phrase.
Yeah, well, Gandhi used it to mean not only the struggle for independence or the struggle against oppression, but the struggle to build a good society. So it has a constructive dimension, which Gandhi thought was the most important dimension if it was most underdeveloped. It was the same way with the movement. I mean, this was the pivotal moment in 1968. And it was King's vision and others' vision of a poor people's movement that would be interracial. But it was, I mean, Bayard Rustin, who was King's great mentor in nonviolence, actually, much more than Gandhi, April. Rustin wrote a very important piece in 1965 called From Protest to Politics, and he didn't mean electoral politics. He meant thinking strategically and carefully and broadly about the coalitions and the spirit and the changes in institutions as well as in policies that would be needed to address the really deep problems that we continue to face, like housing, like crime, like unemployment and automation, like despair and nihilism, a sense of hopelessness in poor communities, but also differently among, opiate-infested working class communities in rural Ohio. So Rustin's statement, which was in Commentary magazine, is still worth reading. It really has very important strategies, like not only broad political coalitions, but community organizing is one, and the idea of that we really are not going to make change unless we transform the culture of institutions. I think that's an enormous challenge and opportunity. But so we're still struggling with how to shift from a negative understanding of nonviolence or a struggle against oppression to combining that with a struggle for creating a just and thriving community. That's really, and so King's book, his last book, Where Do We Go From Here? That was all about it. His speech on power and love and the need to combine them was about combining both to create a positive vision for the country.
And so that becomes the substance of this idea of the beloved community, which is,
well, it's the way to get to a beloved community.
well, right. Yeah. And so that concept, that idea, it is something that, first of all, it is in sort of the literature of Braver Angels at this point. We make reference to that in one of our founding documents. But beyond that, I think that it's an important thing to sort of, in our closing minutes here, kind of drill into a little bit, because I think that for anything to really take shape, there has to be a vision of what it looks like at its end, right? On the one hand, we all seek to pursue justice, we seek to pursue equality, but even those things are means to an end, right? They're means to a better world, a world in which we can treat each other to the utmost of our moral capacity and enjoy what King would have described as a positive peace. Not
positive liberty, positive freedom.
Yeah, a peace that is merely the absence of violence. And so I'd be curious to ask, well, April and Damien, I'd love to hear from both of you. April, we'll start with you quickly. When you sort of think about the beloved community, the end point of the society we want to reach, what does that look like? What is that? How does that flower in your imagination?
It's funny. I don't think I was ever taught. I mean, in school, I learned the phrase, right? When we all studied Martin Luther King and all that. But somehow that idea has feels like it's been in me from the beginning. And maybe that's true of all of us. I also it's a little, I have a little trouble disambiguating it with the term heaven in some cases. But it's just, I think that there is so Damien, you mentioned the word relationality. And I think it is, so I'm a huge fan of the phrase truth and reconciliation. I probably mentioned that too much on these podcasts, because I believe in deep truth and deep reconciliation. And I think that the one can lead to the other. And so to me, the beloved community is a place where truth is respected, reified, acted out, and reconciliation is complete. And so there's another simple way to put it, that I have a friend named Mac McCarter who is trying to block by block. It's a very impressive organization, build relationships back at the local level that will then sort of form the foundation for a healthier society, and just doing that work really on the ground. His statement is simple. It's a world where every child can grow up safe and loved. And I think that that too captures it pretty much, because all the things that would need to happen for that to be true amount to a beloved community. And so I think it's a beautiful thing. And I'm glad that you asked that, because I think that's essential that's Braver Angels' endpoint too, right? We focus on one particular chasm, one particular sort of fracture in society, but that is what we're aiming for. And that is the positive vision that we are working for and chasing and trying to remind people is out there and is worth pursuing, even on days when it seems easier to give up.
There are a lot of days like that, we know, but that's exactly why having that vision before us, I think, is vital. And so, Damien, I'm curious to hear your answer to that question.
So thinking about the beloved community, and thinking about, we've had conversations about this before, Harry, just about King as a political philosopher in many respects, and theologian. But the term that comes to mind is this idea of somebodiness that King talked about specifically. And he talked about it in the context of, when you have all of these kind of symbols around you, be it policy, be it kind of just the social interaction or lack thereof, that would suggest you're nobody, we have to recognize the somebodiness and your own somebodiness in order to really create a situation in which there is a level of mutual respect for the humanity of people, right? So I think there is this deep call for us to recognize the humanity of people in the way that we acknowledge and recognize our own humanity. And King, really wraps it up in this notion of somebodiness, that we are all somebody and we all have that. We're all reflections, to a point Harry made earlier. We are all, reflections of God. That's kind of the kind of theological end of it. But I think the somebodiness as a term really transcends the theological piece. Speaking of moral language, it really gives us a way to just begin to think and feel about how we're supposed to engage in the context of creating and forming this beloved community. So that's how I think about it. And that's how I try to simplify it, in a space where, we can get so wrapped up in the minutia of arguments that we forget that we're talking to a person.
I think that's great. Let me just make one little coda here. Somebodiness for King also meant the dignity of work.
Mm-hmm.
And it's often lost that work, first of all, work was at the center of the Black freedom struggle, from the struggle for 40 acres and a mule. I never realized, but also a friend of mine, a great Black community organizer, Gerald Taylor, calls the knowledge artisans which created foundations of power in the Black community, like the churches and the schools and the colleges and the businesses. But it was central to the movement. The dignity of work. And King's great speech in Memphis on March 18th on the dignity of work was that, first of all, janitors and maids and garbage workers have as much value and contribute in their own ways to society as much as the highfalutin professionals, but also that the measure of work is whether you're contributing to the uplifting of humanity. So somebodiness for King was also embodied in the uplifting of humanity, the betterment of others and the betterment of communities. And I think it's very interesting now, this period of COVID, that it's made visible workers who were invisible.
Mm-hmm.
And I just saw a Harvard Business School study that showed that 9 out of 10 Americans say they would take less money if they had jobs with meaning. So I think there's a deep hunger for purpose and dignity and somebodiness in the work we do.
Mm-hmm. And it is the work that we will continue to do. Harry Boyte, Damien Connors, April Lawson. And I'm John Wood Jr. Folks, thank you very much for joining us today on the Braver Angels podcast. If you are interested in the work that we are doing, if you are interested in rebuilding the broken bonds that exist between the American people and helping us to march forward towards the beloved community, then support our work. Join us as a member. That is braverangels.org. Like, share, and subscribe to this podcast. We are building a house united. Until next time, folks. Take care.